Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Scholand, and I'm speaking to you from the Smart Sustainability in Lighting and Controls platform, the SSLC platform, which is part of the IEA's Technology Collaboration Program. And today is the third of a series of three studies looking at the health effects of solid-state lighting. We have Dr. Christopher Martensons with us, who's going to be presenting this last session on photobiological safety and glare. And I just wanted to say, before I have a little biography on Christophe, I wanted to just say, Christophe will go through the whole presentation, and during that time, we invite you to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you have. At the end, we will stop and go through those questions and respond to them. Or if you prefer, at the Q&A session at the end, you can just simply click on the raise hand button, raise your hand, and we will unmute you, and you'll be able to ask your question live. So whichever is easiest for you. We really like and really value the Q&A session at the end, so please do participate in that. Okay, so without further ado, let me read you Christophe's bio. So Christophe Martensons is a physicist working in the field of optics and lighting at the CSTB in Grenoble, France. He works for governments, public agencies, and municipalities to improve the quality of lighting installations through a careful consideration of environmental impacts and human health effects. He is the current president of CIE France and a recipient of the 2024 Fresnel Medal awarded by the French Lighting Association. Super. Okay, Christophe, I am going to stop sharing, and now you have control.
My turn now. Hello,
Your
everyone.
Excellent.
Glad to be here today, and time for me to share my slides so that we can start with this study about glare and photobiological safety. So I think it should work.
Yep.
Okay.
It looks perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So this webinar is follows the publication of this report, the Solid-State Lighting and Control Platform report that was issued last month, actually. So we had several authors, and each one of us participated in webinars. So today I'm talking about glare and photobiological safety, but I was not the only one involved in this work. The first question we may ask is why review the health effect of LEDs again, knowing that we published a report 10 years ago already in 2014. And in the meantime, we had several health agencies which published also their own assessment. So 2024, we have to say that some users still complain about solid-state lighting and LEDs. Globally, worldwide, the individual exposure to LEDs has increased globally. And it's not necessarily linked to lighting. It's always LEDs. It can be LEDs that you find in displays, in other objects, but our work will focus on lighting. The third point is that we have new research helping us to understand the effects of light on the human being, so advances in physiology and medicine. Also, now we would like to focus on everyone, basically. So the inclusiveness is very important. We have sensitive people. We should recognize their own sensitivity. So we should think of them when designing products or designing lighting installations. Sensitive populations and their specific needs should be identified. That was one of the main objectives of our work in 2024. For lighting manufacturers, this report will help identify features of LED lamps and luminaires that can be improved to achieve better outcomes in terms of health and well-being. So we would like to provide guidance to the lighting industry, knowing that if you reduce negative health effects, you improve lighting quality and customer satisfaction will follow. Public health is also concerned, and the awareness of the general public. It's important to protect the sensitive people against some adverse effects of light that may occur. And we need to inform of the needs of a proper exposure. So it's in addition to designing good products, we need to behave well with respect to light. And we need to expose ourselves to both light and darkness in our everyday life. The objectives are also to improve lighting regulations, standards, and specifications for procurement, for example, and identify areas where more research is needed, since we are researchers. The authors of these reports are researchers. We'll focus on general lighting products, so basically lamps and luminaires based on LEDs for general indoor and outdoor lighting. And we won't really address automotive lighting and light sources that are not lighting products, such as toys and displays. This work was funded by the IEA Technology Collaboration Program 4E SSLC. It was called the SSL Annex before. And it's a collaboration between 3 research teams from public institutes in Australia, Canada, and France. So all the funding to write this report was provided by governments and also from the SSLC platform itself. Work was based on reviews of actual reviews, so reviews of reviews published during the last decades. And when reviews weren't available, we examined individual research papers from the last decade, and sometimes older when there was no newer references. We also examined standards, guidelines, other reports, of course. So today, this talk will concern glare and photobiological safety, and especially the acute effects on the eye. And we'll have some policy recommendations at the end of this talk. Light detection basics. So we'll deal a lot with the eye and vision in this presentation about glare and photobiological safety. So in our eyes, we have a retina, which is the photosensitive tissue of the eye. And in our retina, we have cones which sense colors. Well, we have 3 different kinds of cones, and the combination of those cones and how they react to light will produce color vision in the brain. We have rods, which dominate in the periphery of the retina, and they sense low light levels, and they are very sensitive to motion, to transient signals. We also have intrinsically photosensitive, photoreceptive retinal ganglion cells, which are involved in the circadian regulation of the biological clock. And for our concern about photobiological safety, I will point out with my mouse here this red layer in the retina, which is the retinal pigment epithelium, the RPE. It's a very important part of the retina. It's a layer of cells which actually feed the photoreceptors and help them regenerate during the normal vision process. So what is glare? Glare, we all know what it is, actually, difficult to define it. It's the fastest adverse effect to be experienced with lighting. It occurs very quickly, and people are aware of it. It's a physiological phenomenon, so it's not in your head. Sometimes people mention that glare is psychological, but no, it's actually physiological. It's still the #1 complaint about lighting installations. It's very commonly expressed by users. The consequence of glare is an immediate effect on visual performance, and it increases in an indirect manner the risk of accidents and falls. Glare has also health consequences after prolonged exposure, and there are very sensitive populations. We'll see that in more detail. We have different forms of glare that will that were very well described in this book, a very good reference for human factors in lighting by Peter Boyce. So the different form of glare that are detailed in this book are saturation glare. Saturation glare happens when you have too much light at the eye, really, too much light to allow vision. So the entire visual field is saturated and we have a sensation of pain. The levels may be hazardous to the eye, which brings us later to the photobiological safety field. We also have another form of glare, which happens when there is a rapid increase in the light level. It's called adaptation glare. Usually, vision takes a few seconds to adapt when there is a quick variation of light. It often happens when you drive in a tunnel and you reach the end of the tunnel and you see the outdoor light reaching your eyes. It creates a white sensation, which quickly disappears, fortunately. A form of glare is called disability glare, and it deals with viewing bright light source on dark background. And in these conditions, you may see a halo of light around bright sources. This halo of light is caused by light diffusion within your eyes. So it's a phenomenon that happens in the eye and not outside. So this halo is something that is individually perceived. It reduces the visibility of dimmer objects around this bright source because of this veiling phenomenon. There's a strong influence of age, which you can find in the mathematical formulas for several indices such as TI and GR that we'll explain a little later. It's mostly experienced at night, and it can be experienced with or without any discomfort. So disability glare is not necessarily linked with discomfort or pain or whatever. It can be very smoothly experienced. There is not a lot of research paper investigating disability glare from LEDs versus older technologies. So a few examples of disability glare. You see on the photo here on the left side that the halo that you see and that is produced by your intraocular diffusion of light is a perfect shape disc. Actually, it's circular. So this is just a picture. So in the picture, the diffusion might be caused by something else. But when you see what you see with your eyes is this type of phenomenon. And the stripes here are not caused by your eyes. It's such an artifact with the sensor, probably, for the picture. It also happens with the sun when you have very high level. And those two photos are interesting because they illustrate the effect of age, where young subjects can see the glaring source and experience a veiling phenomenon. But older subjects might be completely blinded by such a veiling phenomenon. So it really depends on the age. Discomfort glare. Discomfort glare is not a very good term I'll tell you about later. It's created by luminance contrast. It's very common in indoor lighting, but still not quite easy to assess. When you assess the quality of indoor environmental quality, it's one of the top-rated factors affecting the indoor environmental quality. There's a large body of research work since more than a century and new concerns with LEDs and solid-state lighting in general. So here you see luminance contrast because you have very bright sources against a dark surface, the dark ceiling, which is not very good for visual comfort. Same thing here on the right side. It's more of an industrial setting or maybe a school, we don't really know, but the luminaires here are very bright, even if the ceiling is not dark like the other one. Discomfort glare has to do with high luminance contrast. So luminance is usually expressed in candela per square meter. And when you experience discomfort glare, it's not necessarily linked with high luminance high illuminance at the eye, so high levels of light, I would say. So the lux that you can measure with the lux meter does not reflect discomfort glare at all. Discomfort glare comes from the difficulty for the visual system to work when there is a high dynamic in the field of vision for a long time. So the visual system works, but the consequence of this higher difficulty is discomfort, of course, annoyance, stress, and aversion response. But it's important to recall that although vision is more difficult, you can maintain perfect visual performance on the short term. It's not like disability glare where you have a halo around the light source, but efforts are required and it has consequences. This remark is more of a personal remark because we have to notice that discomfort glare is somewhat misleading. It suggests that the phenomenon is psychological, all in your head, because discomfort is individually and subjectively perceived. I would prefer the term contrast glare, but it's not an official term. So discomfort is actually a subjective consequence of glare. It's discomfort from glare. And discomfort in itself is subjective, is something that can be assessed by psychological methods or psychophysics. So psychophysics usually relies on individual judgment based on control stimuli, psychometric scales, different methods. And those protocols, like all protocols in assessment of comfort, are not always free of bias. But basically, discomfort is physiological as a consequence of what I said before, an increased difficulty of the visual system. So in the literature, during the last 10 years, we have new methods that emerge to monitor the physiological and behavioral responses to glare, including eye tracking, EEG, functional magnetic resonance imaging, brain oximetry, different kinds of sensors. And it brought us some new knowledge about discomfort from glare. You can see here a photo of a colleague in France wearing all kinds of sensors and looking at an eye tracking device in addition. It is not shown on this photo. So what was learned from these physiological measurements? They provided direct proofs that the reading performance is decreased under a glaring source. Glare influences many ocular parameters. So when you work with eye trackers, eye tracking devices, you notice, the researchers notice variation in saccade speed, saccade amplitude, fixation time, and all sorts of outcomes, also pupil size, and they are not consciously perceived. That is important because when you experience glare, and sometimes it's similar to temporal light modulation in ways that you are not consciously perceiving those phenomena, but they do affect your physiology. So these represent promising approach to study glare, but more research is needed to identify what the most significant parameters are, because they depend on the task, whether you read, whether you do sorting of colors, etc. Some researchers study how discomfort from glare translates in the brain, how it affects the brain activity. So what are the neural correlates of discomfort glare? So there's actually a link that was shown in the literature between visual discomfort and increased blood flow in the brain. It's called the hemodynamic response. It also reflects that working under glare is more intensive for the brain, requires more efforts and more oxygen. The periodic patterns in the field of view are very critical. They create discomfort at specific frequencies. It's very similar to flicker, actually, where you have frequencies that are almost resonant in your brain and create some high level of discomfort. So there's a relationship between temporal light modulation and spatial light modulation, and it also affects glare. And it's not uncommon to find those patterns, very uncomfortable patterns in indoor settings. You can have bars or alternating black and white zones, which can be very contrasted. And this is not perceived very well usually. Same thing with the non-uniformity of the luminance. When you have non-uniformities, you have contrasts, and it actually increases the discomfort. The phenomenon was well studied in indoor lighting. It actually led to a new or a correction of the existing UGR index, the Unified Lighting Rating, that is standardized by the CIE. And we can notice that outdoors, we have many streetlights that are non-uniform, and they are sometimes seen at close range. So you can really perceive the non-uniformity when you are a pedestrian walking under such a light source here on the right side. But there was no study investigating the outdoor luminaires seen at close range, especially the effect of non-uniformity at close range. Now, when we reviewed the literature, we found some papers revealing the influence of the spectrum and the color on discomfort glare. So we have consistent results showing that cold white LEDs are more glary than warm white LEDs, all things being equal. We have several models of spectral sensitivity to discomfort glare that were published. And the main feature is a variation between central vision and peripheral vision. In peripheral vision, glare is influenced by the blue light content. And there's a role of the blue cones, the short wavelength cones, more exactly. But there's still no agreement on the spectral sensitivity curve. Here on the right side, you can see a graph that was published in 2018 with different discomfort glare sensitivity function as a function of the wavelength. The effects of age on glare, on discomfort glare, were also demonstrated in some studies, and it was found that children and young adults experience more discomfort from glare, and they experience it faster than older adults. And one study showed that when you are an older adult, if you work for a long time under a glaring source, after the exposure to glare, you have delayed effects and a decrease of your visual performance in low light conditions. So you may have delayed effects of long exposure to glare. In this graph here, it's an example of the luminance threshold for young and older elderly people with different colors. And for example, with blue light, green light, and amber light, the young people consistently detect glare at a lower level, so they are more sensitive. It was not found for white light in this study. Circadian aspects of discomfort glare. We have a limited number of studies, and they reveal that discomfort from glare increases during the day, showing a greater sensitivity to glare in the morning. So same thing, if you look at this graph, the threshold for the detection of glare is smaller in the morning, so higher sensitivity to glare in the morning, increasing in the day, and sort of plateauing in the afternoon and the evening. This is just one extract from this study, which shows a lot of more results. Discomfort from glare is influenced by the chronotype. So whether you are an early bird type or a night owl type, you don't exhibit the same sensitivity to glare. And the mechanisms behind that are not really known. And there are currently some investigations on the role of the RPRGCs, the ganglion cells responsible for the regulation of the biological clock. When you have glare, you have also potential health effects. Glare can trigger and aggravate headaches in people suffering from migraines. And an extreme form of discomfort from glare is called photophobia, which means fear of light. And we have sensitive people exhibiting fear of light. Prolonged exposure to glare contributes to asthenopic syndromes, which are eye fatigue, eye strain, muscular pains in the neck, for example. And of course, some basic health effects of glare are safety issues, because if your vision is impaired, you may have accidents, you may fall, and you may have a lot of different kind of occupational hazards with machines and tools and so on. We have some metrics for discomfort glare. We have the UGR, and a UGR specifically defined for small source. We have table, which are convenient for manufacturers, UGR tables, and the standard from the CIE is this one, the CIE 190, describing those tables, how to generate them. And in 2019, we have a CIE technical report on discomfort glare from non-uniform sources, especially LED arrays and strips. So when you have a luminaire with bright sources separated by darker spaces. In street and road lighting, we have several models. The Adrian's model is widely used, but we also have others that were published more recently. We have several teams working in France and elsewhere, but working on what the pedestrian may experience in terms of discomfort with urban LED lights. And we have this CIE report published in 2021, with a latest edition in 2023, summarizing the knowledge about discomfort glare in road lighting and vehicle lighting. For outdoor lighting, we have two metrics for disability glare: the glare rating, which is essentially applied to stadium lights, the threshold increment index, the TI, which also describe disability glare of vehicle drivers experiences road lighting. It's all part of the European lighting standards, actually, for outdoor lighting. The UGR and variations or variants of UGR are not validated outdoors, although they may be used by some people, but they are still not validated. It's important to know. The effect of non-uniformity of luminaires is not really well known outdoors, and the effects of multiple sources in the field of view are currently being investigated. I have colleagues in France working in that field. So the main conclusions on glare are that glare is still the #1 source of complaints with lighting. It alters vision during and after exposure, triggers headache, responsible for eye strain. So it's during and after long or prolonged exposure. There is the importance of the product optical design because it has to do with luminance. So the size of the source is very important. Its own luminance, it's very important. And the uniformity of the luminance is important. There's an influence of the spectral distribution, and it translates into something in your brains that we start understanding, but we don't still fully understand. And there's an influence of age. So some recommendations for minimizing glare. Large area uniform SSL luminaires seem to work well in indoor lighting with long exposure time. So not necessarily in your home, but for schools and offices, seems to work well. Non-uniform luminaires for indoor application should be assessed using the proper non-uniform correction of the UGR. The optical design of SSL products should be improved. We should definitely have products without direct viewing of the LEDs as far as possible. So the use of diffusers or specific optical devices is recommended. And when it's not possible, we should recommend to use a shading device. And when it's not possible, we should recommend not to view, not to look at or to stare at the luminaire or the lamp. Sensitive people to glare are migraineurs, people adverse to strong lights, and children and young adults are more likely or more sensitive to glare. There's a link between those categories of people with the sensitivity to temporal light modulation. And we don't know yet if those two people are the same, but they fall into the same categories, for example, migraineurs. Night workers, glare is intrinsically highly critical, I would say, at night for two things, because the vision is more sensitive at night with the circadian aspect, and also the contrasts are higher at night because of the absence of daylight, of course. So you are more likely to experience glare at night. So we have categories of highly exposed people here displayed in magenta color. Drivers and pedestrians at night are really highly exposed to glare, and workers using strong lights. So we, our lighting professionals, are exposed to strong lights because we work with light. But athletes and, for example, in stadium at night, artists on stage, they are really exposed to strong lights and experience glare. So these recommendations for these people, well, we have to avoid direct viewing and avoid periodic patterns of light. And cold white being more critical, we should use cold white light with care, only if necessary. Older adults should avoid long exposure to glare because of possible delayed effects. And of course, people at night should reduce their exposure. Knowledge gaps. So we still have any results on the non-uniformity in darker conditions, so in outdoor lighting. The combined effect of multiple glare sources is not well known. We still have a missing agreement on the spectral sensitivity, and we don't have any standards for the spectral sensitivity of discomfort glare. The role of each specific photoreceptor type, including the RPRCGs, is not quite known. We have found in the literature an influence of the circadian clock, but we don't really know the mechanism for this. And what happens in the brain, so the neural mechanisms leading to visual discomfort and light aversion is being studied, but we don't understand everything. The influence of age should be more studied, I think, because we found some differences and we should elucidate them. And what is not known is actually the dose-effect relation between glare, exposure to glare, and headaches, because it takes time. It's not necessarily instantaneous. And it's, of course, very difficult for lighting people to carry out provocation studies with sensitive people. We need to have medical doctors to carry out such studies. So we have another 30 minutes for photobiological safety. So let's move on to this field. Photobiological safety refers to acute effects of optical radiation on the eye and on the skin. So it concerns not only the visible light, but also the UV and infrared radiations, because all these types of optical radiations may induce thermal and photochemical effects on the skin and on the eye. Those radiations can burn your skin, can produce some sunburn, erythemal injuries, and you can have many types of different conditions. So we don't have a lot of UV and infrared with our LEDs used in lighting. We have, of course, other types of LEDs emitting infrared and UV, but in lighting, we favor the use of visible light for obvious reasons. So most visible light, most LEDs emitted visible light don't really affect the skin, except you take special medication, photosensitive medication, or you have certain rare conditions such as lupus. UV and infrared may cause injuries to the cornea, iris, and lens, for example, cataract or photokeratitis. But again, with our LEDs, we don't have a lot of UV, basically none. We don't have infrared, so those won't be addressed in the presentation. What we do have potentially is retinal hazards. So because visible light, as well as some part of the UV and some part of the infrared, visible light is focused on the retina. So this is the main tissue that is affected by light. Same thing. So here in this talk, you will see a lot of mentions of the retinal pigment epithelium, which is one of the bottom layers of the retina, very important in the proper functioning, cones and rods. So the retinal hazards are in two kinds. They come in two different varieties. The thermal hazards, so it's basically a burn in the retina. And this happens with near-infrared light because it is thermally active and it is also focused directly by the crystalline lens on the retina. It has never been demonstrated with LEDs used in lighting systems. The opposite, we have another type of hazard, which is photochemical, involving the direct action of photons on organic molecules. The photochemical hazards in the retina have two subtypes. Type 1, which is associated with very bright light and probably with high-intensity saturation glare. And this type of hazard is very rarely observed with LEDs. It creates, it produces the death of photoreceptors very rapidly and doesn't show any spectral sensitivity. So basically, all colors are concerned, and it happens with very, very high levels of light. On the opposite, we have a second type of photochemical hazard called the blue light hazard, and this is the dominant hazard for LEDs. It basically a result of photochemical reactions triggered by the short wavelength photons, blue, violet, or near UV, directly in the cells of the retinal pigmented epithelium, the RPE. So those cells in this specific layer of the retina really absorbs the blue wavelength photons and affect it. The peak of this hazard is in the blue between 430 and 440 nanometers. And the cell death mainly happened in this RPE, but since the RPE is affected and injured, the cell death extends to photoreceptors that may die in turn. The important thing with the blue light hazard, it is not necessarily associated with glare. Glare may or may not happen with the blue light hazard. Why is that? Because the blue and violet light does not produce a high visual stimulus. And blue light is not known to produce a strong aversion response. So you may not experience glare, for example, with pure blue light. You will experience glare with strong white light, and it can be also a cause for the blue light hazard, but pure blue is not connected to a strong glare response. So these are examples of what happens in the RPE of retina. Here, a rat retina. When it's not illuminated, the cells are all tight together and they create a barrier between the blood flow behind the eye and the photoreceptors. When the RPE and retina is exposed to blue light, so here a 6-hour exposure, continuous exposure on the rat, you see some problems with the RP. It's not proof anymore, it's not tight, and cells start dying. So there is no proper functioning of this RP after acute exposure. And we have now in the literature a few case reports of eye injuries caused by an exposure to LED lights, accidental exposure. And the doctors who investigated those injuries found that the injuries caused by LEDs were very similar to injuries found in people looking at solar eclipses, so solar maculopathy, or welders. So it's really linked to the blue part of the spectrum. When you look at the solar eclipse, you may have a lot of problems with your cornea and your crystalline lens, but the retinal injuries are caused by blue light. And the same thing happened in this case report with a high intensity LED. The blue light hazard function describes the sensitivity, the spectral sensitivity of the blue light hazard. It peaks at about 430 to 440 nanometers. It's called the B lambda function, and it's standardized. So we may ask questions when we look at the spectral distribution of a common LED. Here it's a cold white LED. We have this blue peak, and it's not good because it doesn't look good because the blue peak really falls in the spectral sensitivity of the blue light hazard, this B lambda function. So I have to insist that this interpretation is really misleading. And in a lot of older presentations, researchers, including myself, systematically presented this type of representation. But it's not a reflect of the reality. We had a paper earlier this year that showed that according to the type of representation, you can really distort the graphical interpretation of this type of graph where you superimpose a spectral distribution and an action spectrum. So this is actually the common representation of the spectral distribution of an LED and the blue light hazard function in terms of spectral radiant flux. But if you move to another representation, if you use the photon units instead of the radiometric units, and if you use the photon frequency or energy to describe the x-axis, you get a totally different view of the spectral distribution. And for example, the blue peak is not really a peak here. It's not as important, as high as the phosphor peak. So it's not possible to tell that cold white LEDs emit more light in the blue region because it really depends on the representation. So I have to insist on the fact that it's not possible to just look at graphs and decide about how bad the blue peak is. And what is more adapted to describing the potential for a type of spectral distribution to cause the blue light hazard is to work out the blue light hazard efficacy, which is a standard parameter defined by the CIE. It's the number of watts falling in the range of B lambda divided by the lumen output. So the photopic action of the light. And you see here a correlation more or less linear, but not really perfect between CCT, the correlated color temperature, and the blue light hazard efficacy. It seems to be linear, but it's not. And if you have, for example, warm white LEDs, you can have twice as more blue light efficacy for those warm white LEDs for the same color temperature. So there's quite large variations, and the same conclusions apply to melanopic EDI. You can't really correlate the melanopic efficacy to color temperature. It's a rough correlation, but it's not a perfect correlation. If you plot the B lambda function, so the blue light hazard sensitivity and other sensitivities for the types of photoreceptors that you have in a retina, you see that it's a quite different spectrum, because you have sensitivities to short wavelengths that are not visual sensitivities, especially for the S cones, the so-called blue cones. The right tail of this B lambda function seems to follow this blue cone sensitivity, but it really extends toward the near infrared here. And this is not visual sensitivity. This is just the sensitivity to photochemical damage. When people have a greater transparency of the eye, such as with children or with people without a crystalline lens, you don't have a B lambda sensitivity, you have an A lambda sensitivity, another function defined in standards. And this function does not have any cutoff towards the infrared like B lambda has. It extends toward the UV, not infrared. It extends toward the UV range here because you don't have this filtering effect of the crystalline lens. So we have limit values for the blue light hazard, and these were defined by the ICNIRP, the international organization in charge of this. The limits were defined by using research from a single team, Ham and colleague, dating from the 70s, 1970s, 1976 and 79. And from this damage threshold expressed in terms of retinal irradiance dose, so dose of irradiance in the retina, not at your eye, but at the retina directly, you can derive, or the ICNIRP derived a limit value on the retina of 2.2 joules per square centimeter. There is an approximate safety factor of 10 between those two values. And what the ICNIRP did was to transpose this retinal illuminance into the luminance, or the radiance, more exactly, the radiance of the source. So in the safety standards, we have a source emission limit expressed in terms of blue-weighted radiance dose in joule per square meter per steradian. And the translation between the two was done with this simple formula here. So what we found in the literature when we reviewed the literature for the past decade, we found that the blue light hazard was detected below this current exposure limit. Two factors can explain that. The detection of retinal damage is now better than what it used to be in the 1970s. And we have studies on other animals. We have studies on rats, on diurnal animals, and also monkeys. And one such study was published just last month, and it was not actually included in our studies because it was too recent. But other studies also shown that retinal damage from the blue light hazard really happened below the current exposure limit. We found that the retina of children is more exposed for simple reasons. The child's eye is more open. If you look at the biometric parameters of a child's eye, you have a pupil diameter that is slightly larger, especially for babies, and a shorter eyes, so the focal length is reduced. And if you do optics and you compute the relative aperture of those optical systems, I would say, you find maybe 3 times more light at the retina transmitted by a child eye compared to an adult eye. In addition to that, you have a crystalline lens that is more transparent. And all those parameters stabilize at around 10 for the transmittivity of the lens and about 13 for the growth of the eye. So with a similar level of light at the eye, your retina can be exposed 3 times more if you're a child. And also, the aversion response to bright light is not fully developed in children, and it can be bypassed on purpose, just to play. The retina was found to be more sensitive at night, so phototoxicity actually depends on the circadian clock. And we have some explanations for that. At night, the retina is supposed to rest, and cleaning mechanisms should be at play, such as phagocytosis, the cleaning of residues made by the oxidation effects of blue light. We have protective effects of longer wavelengths that were revealed by the research literature. There's positive effects of a technique called photobiomodulation, a technique consisting of applying red and near-infrared light to heal damaged tissues, including the skin, but also the eye. And we found some accelerated healing processes when exposed to red light, because the mitochondrial activities of the RPE cells and phagocytosis are increased. There are promising medical applications, but not enough data to apply that to general lighting. So if a lighting manufacturer would have the idea of adding a red or near-infrared light to protect you from the phototoxic effect of blue light, we would say that there's not enough foundations and not enough results to say that it's actually useful. We have a standard to assess the photobiological safety of lamp. It's the IEC CIE 62471. And this standard provides us with a classification of hazards, but it only applies to adults without eye pathology because it uses the B lambda curve and not the A lambda curve or other curves. And it also uses the current threshold that was shown to be slightly overestimated compared to what we found in the literature. So we can classify our lamps and luminaires in different risk groups from 0 to 3. And it all depends on the time you need to stare continuously at the source to reach the limit of exposure. So we examined all the published data concerning the emission of products that can be related to the blue light hazards. And for lighting, the news is good because SSL products sold in the last 5 years for domestic and office lighting are really comparable with other sources, the legacy sources, in terms of blue light hazard. UV LEDs, blue LEDs, cold white LEDs, when they are tested and used as bare components, they may harm the retina, and most of them are classified in risk group 2, but these are not lighting products, just components. And those values are reported by the LED manufacturers themselves. We don't have data on the blue light hazard and the level of blue light, the blue light radiance of high power professional LED luminaires for stadium lighting, architectural lighting, stage lighting, for instance. So we would like to have those data and assess the risk levels. So the main conclusions on the photobiological safety of SSL products, we have to say that the blue light hazard remains a concern. We have a consistent detection of retinal damage by blue light below the current exposure limit. We have retinal phototoxicity increasing at night. We know that children are not sufficiently protected by current standards and regulations. And we found some encouraging protective effects of near and near infrared light on the retina. The sensitive people are children, people with already pre-existing retinal diseases, such as age-related macular degeneration or glaucoma. They are more likely to experience phototoxic effects from blue light. people wearing lens implants because they don't necessarily have this filtering of blue light without their own crystalline lens. Night workers are more sensitive because the retina is supposed to rest at night and it's not. And people who are highly exposed are us, again, lighting professionals, lighting designers, and workers using strong lights, athletes, artists, same thing as glare, really, stage artists, for instance. So we recommend to update the blue light hazard exposure limit, and we recommend to update the photobiological safety standards by considering sensitive people, including children. They are currently not covered by photobiological safety standards. We should not apply more permissive standards before these updates. And we should actually strengthen the photobiological requirements for people exposed at night and people with reduced aversion response to bright light. We still don't know everything. We missed data on emission of high power professional LED luminaires. We have another generation of white LEDs relying on a UV pump and phosphor converting this UV light into white light. And we don't really have a lot of emission data for this type of LED technology. We should investigate the simultaneous exposure to blue and long wavelength light because all the effects of red light were demonstrated after an injury of the retina. So the benefits of enriching the spectrum is interesting, but we don't know exactly what happens there when you have a full spectrum of light compared to a pure blue light, for example, for the blue light hazard, or a cold white light with discontinuities in the spectrum. We should investigate the influence of age and also age-related pathologies because it really makes the retina more sensitive to short wavelength light. So we can now write some or enunciate policy recommendations for glare and photobiological safety. Because for manufacturers, we should target designing product to minimize the possibility of glare and retinal hazards. Standardization bodies should include an appropriate range of expertise to provide guidance on health effects, developing limit values and validated quantities. We should ensure that sensitive population gets due consideration. For regulators, we should still include photobiological safety among the performance specifications. We should reference, or the regulations should reference appropriate standards and use validated quantity to establish mandatory limits for glare and photobiological safety. And there should be more collaborations between energy and public health authorities to ensure that public spaces do not expose sensitive individuals to glare and retinal hazards from solid state lighting. So it's not only designing good products, it's installing them well with careful considerations of people. So it's basically summarized in 2 sentences: design intrinsically safe lighting products and be careful when installing them. And the last word, just a reminder that light is made of photons, and photons are elementary particles. They are all alike, all the same. So once a photon leaves its light source, we can't say that it's an LED photon or it's a fluorescent light photon. They're all the same. So all these effects, glare and photobiological safety effects, are technology agnostic. We should just be careful about the flow of photons and characteristics of the light source. But light in itself, it's technology agnostic thing. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. And I will stop my sharing.
Great. Thank you, Christophe. That's excellent. I've just put a note in the chat. We are now in the Q&A part of the webinar. So I would encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we do have a few of them in there now, which we'll read off, or to raise your hand to ask a question. And maybe I'll start with the raised hand because Michael Schwartz, you had your hand up from quite early on in the session. Oh, you've taken your hand down. Okay. Sorry about that, Michael. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's go through the boxes then, the questions in the Q&A box. The first one, Christophe, are you aware of any research on neurodivergent people as far as recommendations for sensitive people?
No, I'm not aware, unfortunately. It's a good question. And I think in the category of neurodivergent people, I'm sure we could find sensitive people to glare and to blue light hazard and also to temporal light modulation, but there was no study. So unfortunately, an advice to researchers would be to include those categories of people and to investigate their own sensitivity, especially that because we know that we have a lot of complaints about light and mm, very often sensitivity to light is badly considered or not considered at all, or just put on sunglasses or put the blinds on. And there's actually an intrinsic light sensitivity in at least 10 or 15% of the people, according to what we read. But we didn't investigate, nobody has ever investigating those specific categories of neurodivergent persons.
Okay. Thank you. Next question from Wes Nielsen. You mentioned night workers being more exposed to risk because of missing the retinal cleaning process during sleep. Is this actually linked to the time of day or just sleep duration? For example, if you're sleeping during the day, is your eye still going through that cleaning process?
Mhm. Well, the eye should sleep as all the other organs, including the brain. So it's actually linked to the circadian clock. So not really the time of the day, because if you are used to working at night every day, if you don't alternate shifts, then your circadian clock might be perfectly aligned to the night time. And then if you sleep during the day, I think it's perfectly fine. The problem with night work is that you shift, so you constantly have to adjust to schedules, and this is a real mess for sleep and probably also for your vision. So I would say there's a big difference between working at night occasionally or in a shifting manner, which is not good for vision, for cleaning, retinal cleaning processes. And if you are used to it, and if you do this every day, where your body can adjust. So circadian clock, and it relates to what was also mentioned in the other chapters of the report about the importance of the maintaining a proper exposure to light to stabilize this clock. And if you are a regular nighttime worker, you need to really sleep well during the day. So in a very dark environment, in a silent also environment, quiet place, to recreate the night actually. And it's never easy, but if it were to be done, it would be as good as a real night because the circadian clock would be well in phase with your activities.
Great, thank you. Next question is from David Bowie. David asks, in terms of the recent evidence of more sensitivity to blue light hazard below current limits, as well as sensitivity for children and other sensitive groups, how will this be communicated and considered by the relevant standards committees? Do you know whether specific advice could be issued by relevant committees for risk to children and other sensitive groups?
It's again a good question because basically behind this question is how to make people aware in standards group or in committees or regulatory bodies, how to make them aware of our findings. It really depends on the type of committee. For example, in Europe, the European Standard Organization is mandated by the European Union to produce or to update a standard. It's not necessarily the case of the IEC, for example, the International Electrotechnical Commission, which can really produce any type of standard according to the members' wishes. And there are votes, of course. So legal ways would be more efficient through government branches, ministries of health, and so forth. Um, but otherwise, it's very difficult for a group of researchers on their own to push because we don't necessarily have this legitimacy. If we were the SSLC platform, if we were a health agency, our results would be automatically, mechanically sent to the authorities, health ministries, and it would be taken into account and adapted into some kind of legal reactions, more some mandates, I would say, for standards. But being the SSL annex, originally we are more energy people, and it comes to the last conclusion of this webinar, saying that we need more collaborations between energy people and health people to advance this and transpose this knowledge into regulations. But otherwise, I would say that the easiest way would be us as the SSLC platform to join a committee, a standard committee for photobiological safety, and to communicate with our people in government agencies. I don't know any magic trick to speed things up because this takes time.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Christophe. Okay, next in queue is Stephen Cahill. Stephen has raised his hand and would like to ask his question live, so I'm just unmuting you, Stephen. Can you speak, please? You're muted at the moment. Maybe you've we haven't stepped away from your desk. Stephen, can you hear us? Okay.
Can't
Maybe
hear.
there's a problem with the microphone. Let's go to the next question from Richard Cuthbert. Richard asks, any type of eye protection, such as colored lenses for those working with high power LEDs, bracket sports?
Okay, it's a good question because Richard asked if there is an individual protective equipment that we can use. So special filtering goggles, safety goggles. So I'm not sure they do exist with the specific blue light hazard in specification. In the lab, we use laser goggles, so goggles to filter blue lasers, which also work for LEDs, but it's not labeled for LEDs for preventing from the blue light hazard. So I don't think any safety Google manufacturers already came up with a specific equipment. It would be a good idea for us, especially for high power LEDs. So those laser goggles can be used as temporary solutions. It's better than nothing. They are usually orange or yellow because they filter out the blue, and you have to choose them with a high optical density in this blue range. So this is my better advice. I don't have the perfect answer. Use a blue laser safety goggles.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Timothy Shotbolt. Timothy asks, recessed rectangular office lighting luminaires that have a large open concave opening reflector, but narrow central spine opal convex diffuser, which is very much higher luminance. This is promoted as a good melanopic lighting because provides high luminance at eye level and therefore good. But there are complaints about glare and migraines even though apparently complying with lighting standards. Is this a question of producing better parameters for producing beneficial lighting for greater inclusive group of people?
I'm sure if you investigate the luminance distribution, you will find that this large source of light, which is probably very good to produce a high amount, a higher luminance and a lot of light at the eye, as Timothy said, I'm sure that it would be it's probably non-homogeneous in terms of luminance distribution. But we have a problem with this type of luminaires. They are very badly described by standards. If you want to compute the UGR for such a light source, you can't really use the tabulated method that is used when you have a regular pattern of recessed luminaires with a regular spacing. Here, it's very specific. So you need to assess glare using a more fundamental method by measuring the luminance distribution using, for example, an imaging luminance meter device, which is a sort of camera calibrated in luminance, and then apply an algorithm to assess discomfort glare and the true UGR. And it's not easy to do. So I'm sure that we wouldn't necessarily need new standards, but lighting practitioners should have a more precise equipment and more fundamental methods to apply those standards. Otherwise, the question of inclusiveness surely happens when you have something like this. It's not a very common lighting installation, and it needs to be validated in the field. This is the best answer we can have is the acceptance of people. So if you have complaints, that's not good, that's for sure.
Okay, thank you. The next question is a challenging one. Warren Julian asks or comments, based on the observations made in the presentation, it would seem that working or living outdoors is catastrophic.
Oh, not at all. I often get the commentary that blue light is much more intense outdoors because the sky is blue. Well, it's not really true because blue light from the sky is diffuse light. So you have a lot of light on the eye, a lot of illuminance. You can have 20,000 or 50,000 lux at the eye, but the retinal dose is not that great because it's not that high because the blue light hazard is an imaging effect. So an image of a diffuse source is completely diffuse. So the retinal dose that you get from this diffuse light, it's much smaller than a focused image of an LED or a powerful LED luminaire. The only problem outdoors is when you look at the sun, but you have an aversion response and you don't look at the sun. Children may look at the sun to play and they get injuries actually, but nobody gets injuries from the blue sky because the luminance, although you have a high illuminance, high lux, the luminance and the resulting retinal level is not that important, and it's perfectly safe. So don't worry, you can live outdoors, and the blue light hazard is not a concern with the sky, just with the sun.
And and actually, Christophe, another thing, on yesterday's presentation, we were discussing the development of the eye with children and how and the importance of spending time outdoors, in terms of going against what I have, nearsightedness. I know this is a blue light hazard discussion, but if Warren is interested, do watch yesterday's webinar as well, the second one in the series, where that issue is discussed, that the importance of children spending time outdoors for their eyes development.
Yeah. And they need those short wavelengths actually. but not in an acute dose of exposure like in the blue light hazard. They need this diffuse, low luminance sources or low radiance sources of near UV, violet, and blue light. It's required actually for the growth of the eye.
Great. Okay, next question. Wes Nielsen asks, would you consider the objective of delivering high levels of melanopic lux directly to the eye from luminaires and the objective of producing low glare interior environments to be in conflict with each other?
That is certainly a challenge because we say that for maintaining a proper circadian rhythm, we need a lot of melanopic lux, quote, at the eye, especially in the morning. So we might be tempted to increase the levels and to have more powerful sources of light indoors. And of course, it's not compatible with glare. But melanopic lux do not necessarily requires high luminance. That is the same that relates to the previous comment. You need light that is properly directed. And in a sense, when you have ceiling recessed light, it's like a shower of light. It comes to your head, it falls vertically, it's not directly directed at your eyes. And good melanopic light needs to arrive horizontally. So the best source of this horizontally directed light is light coming from the windows. Daylight coming from windows is probably the best. And glare from windows is a well-known phenomenon, and you can have different kinds of shading devices, very simple or very complicated. But there's always a conflict with glare, even with daylight. So low glare, it's low luminance, and it's really important to work out how the light sources are installed. For example, those ceiling recessed light, they don't produce a lot of melanopic lux at the eye because of the vertical direction, but they don't produce a lot of glare if they are just above your head. It's not probably the best because people like to move in their environment, of course, so they may still be able to see it, but directionality and low luminance, I would say it's best.
Great.
Reflected sunlight. So,
Yeah, next question from Warren Julian says, thanks for your previous answer. And what about reflected sunlight and cataracts in fishing, for example?
yeah. The skiers, the fishers, the sailors, they all have more troubles with their retinas when they age. The proportion of age-related retinal diseases is much higher with these populations because they experience repeated exposure to high levels of light during their lives. So one suspicion with the blue light hazard is that when you have sub-threshold exposure, but in a chronic and repeated manner for very, very long time, it's really that can be related to the EMD, the AMD, age-related macular degeneration. And people investigating this age-related macular degeneration, they find a lot of similarities with the blue light hazard. The damages not are not similar, but there are some common mechanisms. But the mechanism between the link between blue light hazard and age-related macular degeneration has not yet been established. But we do observe more injuries from light with these populations working outdoors in very high light levels.
Excellent. Great. Well, just a final round. Any other questions from the audience? Maybe put your hand up or type quickly in the box. I know we're a little bit over time, but it was a lot of information and yeah, lots of good questions as well. I really like the Q&A session. It's my favorite part. Okay. I don't see any more, so maybe we'll wrap this up and say thank you, Christoph, for your
Thank you.
time and the presentation, and thank you everyone for participating today. I will be posting this recording and a PDF copy of Christoph's slides on the website tomorrow on Friday. So everyone who's registered for the webinar will receive a link to that when they're live. So we can keep in touch and keep the dialogue going. So thanks everyone, and good day, good evening, good afternoon. Bye bye now.
Bye bye.